Hey guys, K2's Retro Workshop. Today we're going to go back to the 386SX platform. I have three motherboards here. These two have been on the channel before. This guy was previously upgraded to a 486SLC. This is the stock motherboard. These are identical outside of the processor being swapped. And this guy is a new acquisition that I have that I'm going to get into in a little bit. But first, let's go over this series of motherboards and talk about not only why I'm working with these so much, but the differences between them. Up first is the 386SX board. And just a quick little sidebar here. The 386SX versus DX does not equate to the 486SX and DX. On the 486, the DX has a math coprocessor, the SX doesn't. No 386 has a built-in math coprocessor. All of the boards will have an FPU socket of some sort. It looks different for the DX because there's more pins and such. But just wanted to clarify that right now. These two processors internally are identical. They're both 32-bit processors. They both have the capability of 32-bit addressing. I believe the SX is also technically internally capable of using 32 data ports, but there's only 16 brought out of the chip, so it doesn't really matter. Now, the 386DX came out first. So in 1985, Intel, this is an AMD, but Intel released the 386DX. And it came out with much fanfare. You know, it's got a couple of extra modes, 386 Enhanced and stuff, that allows you to do things with the 386 that you couldn't with the 286. Except, because of the increased amount of pins on here, it's much more complicated to update the motherboards. At the time, the 286 had 24 bits of address bus and 16 bits of data bus, which is what the SX has. At the time, we didn't have nice little ASICs and stuff either. So mid-85, you've got to change a bunch of discrete logic. You've got to add a whole bunch of stuff made for giant motherboards. Another thing that's nice about the SX is, and that's why it came out really. The SX came out because OEMs and stuff, they were looking for an affordable option. And the SX board, you can see here, if I shine a light underneath it, you can see through it. Because there's so few data lines, they can do a 2-layer board with the SX. So it significantly reduces cost to have this platform, which is what they wanted it for. Budget computers and stuff like that. Apple did the same thing with the Classic 2. You know, it was pretty common. So one of the things about the 386, you know, the SX or DX, is that they don't have internal cache. The DX does support external cache on the board. And in our next section here, we're going to have a little bit more longer of a conversation about cache and why it's so significant of an improvement when it comes to these motherboards. So here's the 486SLC. This is a motherboard we made in a previous video, and this is the more longer conversation that I just spoke of. Too much idiocracy, I think. So this motherboard completely changed in its performance and just how nice it is to use in general when we did that upgrade. And it all lies in the 1 kilobyte of cache that's in this processor. And you might wonder how 1 kilobyte can make such a huge difference. So let's go through a little scenario here that shows just why it makes such a huge difference. Let's say you want to multiply two numbers together. You want to multiply two numbers together, and on a 386SX, you have to go to memory for it because there is nothing anywhere else except for registers in the processor. We want to go to RAM, but the last thing we did was set up a DMA transfer. So the memory's busy. Right after that's done, DRAM refresh cycle. Okay, well, we got to wait for that. After all that's done, Then we can finally grab the first 16 bits of our data. After the first 16 bits of data has been retrieved, we can go to the next page and pull the next 16 bits. No big deal, right? Except we've just wasted hundreds of cycles waiting for all of this to happen. The next set comes in, no big deal. Maybe, 20, 30 cycles later, we have our second number, and we're ready to multiply. It takes about 10 cycles to do that, and then we transfer back. All said and done, we're looking at a lot of cycles. And that's worst case, granted. That's not always going to be the case. The bus is going to be idle. That's assuming a busy computer. But what if those two values are in the level 1 cache on the processor? Well, if they are, then the 486SLC simply has to tell the MMU that it wants a certain address. The MMU pulls it from the cache on the processor twice for both operations, for both operators, because internally this is a 32-bit processor. So our cache hits are single 32-bit transactions. And because they're so tightly coupled to the MMU, meaning that the timings are tight, we don't have to wait for the bus to free up, and a host of other things we could probably list here that are different. No DRAM refresh, for example. We can pull those according to the datasheet. We can pull a value in 2 to 3 clock cycles. That's huge. That means that if everything we need is in cache, we can pull both values, multiply them, and return a value to cache in 20 clock cycles. Done. Instead of waiting hundreds of clock cycles to go to RAM, we do it in 30. Done. And that's where the big benefit from this comes from. Now, what I'm going to do is change this out to an 80 megahertz crystal again to set our speed to 40 megahertz so we can get a fair comparison between all three motherboards. Let's look at the next one. So here's the new addition to my workshop. This is a 486SLC2-40. That means that the motherboard runs at 20 megahertz and the processor runs at 40 megahertz. It's clock doubled. This is a late model motherboard, 1994. And as you can see by the beautiful coating of dirt all over it, it looks like it's been sitting outside since 1994, but fortunately not in the sun. That New Mexico sun, whew, man, just got back from Edgar's yesterday, and I gotta tell you, I've never seen a motherboard that was just fiberglass and traces before. But there was a section of a motherboard out there that was literally what it was. The only thing holding the fake cache chips on that motherboard that was outside were the traces that it was attached to. So it's unreal. But this motherboard doesn't have any battery damage. I don't see any physical damage on this. So I think when we give it a bath, it should fire right up. And the reason I picked this up is because I'm very curious about the optimization and stuff. Amdahl's law is something that I guess we'll be testing here. So here we have a 20 megahertz bus with a 40 megahertz processor, so it's clock doubled. What's very common in a lot of these systems, especially these early systems, is when they're not clock doubled or tripled or quadrupled or whatever, these synchronous systems wait for the processor a lot. Especially during gaming. You take Doom. It's got a lot it's got to do behind the scenes, and then there's even more that it has to do to get the picture on the screen. So there's a lot that has to go on. And so we wait for the processor a lot. So we'll be able to test a 20 megahertz bus on a 40 megahertz processor, the same processor, not clock doubled, 40 megahertz with a 40 megahertz bus, and then we'll be able to take the 386SX with no cache, but a 40 megahertz processor on a 40 megahertz bus, and we can compare them. And we'll see how big of a difference cache makes, how big of a difference the memory bandwidth really makes when we're using it. And yeah, we'll explore, play games, and see what we get. But first, let's get this guy working. All right, she's out of the bath. Took longer than I expected to even get it to where it is now. Every time I would go back over it with another scrub or anything like that, I would end up with more dirt coming out. You can probably see here in the corner of this socket, there's still some dirt in the corner there. Almost impossible to get everything out. Does appear, after cleaning it though, that these chips have been sun faded. Not quite as bad as some other chips that I've seen, but yeah, this thing has spent its time in the sun out there in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So let's get some RAM in there, and I'm going to wait on the battery until after I verified this will boot up. So let's throw in our standard I/O controller and video card and everything and see if it fires up. Alright, we are booted up, and I didn't have to replace any capacitors, so we're good to go. And let's load up 3D Bench. I want to show you a really good example just right here, real quick, of the huge difference that even this 1K of level 1 cache makes. You know, look at our frame rate here. I'm not going to have you sit here and watch this whole thing because it takes forever. So, remember this. Keep this in mind. Look how slow we are falling here. Alright? Let's cancel out of there. Let's do a quick reboot. And now, we're going to go to our advanced setup, enable our Cyrix cache, and reboot. Now, it took me a while to get the hard drive adapter to work in this thing. I think a couple of the ISA slots might be bad on this board, so I'm going to have to take a little look at that later. But if we go back into the benchmark, we will see a huge difference in the performance. Doesn't even seem like it's the same computer anymore. Huge changes. And so there you have it. That's the end of our video. Just kidding. I'm going to run a whole slew of benchmarks here. I'm going to do some screen grabs. I think the best way to kind of show these boards and their differences off is going to be to have all three of them on the screen together. So I am going to spend all day tomorrow painstakingly grabbing all of these. There's a couple of benchmarks giving me some DMA errors and stuff. I don't know. I'm going to figure that out offline, and I'll be right back. Alright, this board's being a lot of fun. For some reason, I can run 3D Bench and SpeedSys, a few of these other little things, but I cannot run Doom. If I try to run Doom, I get an involuntary switch to real mode if I boot in anything but just conventional memory mode, and I get a general protection fault if I boot up with just conventional memory. It's the only board doing this. The other two 386 boards, you know, for example, this guy at 50 megahertz does it just fine. And I'm using the same hardware, same RAM, same everything. So what we're going to do, I went ahead online yesterday. I've ordered some new capacitors for this board. So let's recap it real quick. PC chips! Okay, so I figured out why this board's having trouble when I enable the cache and I'm trying to run Doom and stuff like that. I get some general protection faults and some errors like that I showed you earlier. You can see in part of my troubleshooting, I went ahead and did a full recap on this board. That was evidently unnecessary. So, go me. But I'll show you why we're having a problem by first showing you the 386 board. Alright, so this is the 386 board. Now, in order for the cache to actually cooperate with the chipset and some other stuff on the motherboard, it has to have some certain pins connected. One of them is pin 65 over here, and you can see pin 65 runs out this way, goes over this way, and goes to the main chipset. Over here, we've got pins 30 and 29. 29 comes over here to this jumper that you can bridge to hook up the CAN output. I've never actually gotten that output to work right. Every time I bridge it, I end up with system problems. But Pin 30 comes out this way, goes over this way, and then it takes off into the motherboard as well. This is on the 386 motherboard that we did the 486SX swap on, and it worked just fine. Now let's take a look at the PC chips board that I've been trying to get to work. This is the PC chips board with the SXLC2-40 on it. The BS16 line is in this group here, and it all goes out to the chipset like it should. But pin 30 and pin 29 here, which should be going out and doing its thing in the motherboard, terminate to pads here. There are no traces underneath. I've looked. There's a guy on GitHub that actually did a complete reproduction of this board, and you can download the Gerber files and actually order this motherboard and move the parts over and such. That is a really, really cool project, and I would be lying if I wasn't tempted to try and fix this hookup here so that we can actually accomplish what we want. But, and it looks awesome in purple, but without the flush line there, it's possible for us to have a different value in our processor than we do in RAM. I don't think that's much of a problem in protected mode, but real mode seems to have an issue with it, and I believe that's what Doom runs in. I could be getting those backwards. But yeah, let's zoom out on this and I'll talk a little bit more about it. Well, that's where we stand. You know, from the people that brought us fake cache chips on Pentium boards, they started by just not fully implementing some of this stuff. I have a couple of theories here. One, the ASIC here doesn't have the ability to actually control those data lines. I find it odd that they would do that and not have, you know, and then actually leave the option in there for the Cyrix cache value. It does work. I can enable and disable the cache on this chip through the BIOS settings. So I know that works. Another theory is that maybe these two pins here on the ASIC are the lines we need, and it would end up making this a mess, and those would end up over here if they followed these lines. So it would just end up being a big mess, and they said, screw it, we're not doing that. Because previous versions of this board don't implement that, and future versions of this board don't implement that. And actually, I went and looked at the board that I transplanted this 486SLC off of in that last video where I moved it, and they didn't implement the lines there either. So there were quite a few dodgy implementations of the 486SXLC, I think. I used to have a third motherboard of these, and I got rid of it because I figured, what do I possibly need 3 of these motherboards for? And now I'm regretting that I did that. See, that's the hoarder mentality right there, you know? You get rid of something and then a year later you're like, oh man, what did I do? That's how you end up with too much crap everywhere like I do. Anyway, I was able to get quite a few benchmarks to go on this, and I do have a couple of graphical ones and stuff, so we're just going to work with what we have right now. And I have a couple more benchmarks to run on this guy to finish up what we're going to do, but we're still going to have a good comparison. We're still going to have some clear visual changes and indications going on. So, all right, you can see my little bodge wire here. I tried tagging it to these 2 pins and those 2 pins that are not used on this side, with no luck. I'm thinking this ASIC maybe just doesn't have the flush pin capability that it needs to actually use this chip properly. So let's take a look at the results that we have. All right, shut up and show some benchmarks now. Well, maybe not shut up, but far right here we have the SXLC2. That's got the 20 megahertz bus and therefore a little less than half of the read and write speed of the other 2 processors. The write bandwidth between the left 2 is strikingly similar, but the cache doesn't affect writing all that much. The cache is more of a read bump. And so you do see that. You have the 19 megabytes over the 17. You'll also notice that on the graphs themselves, the SLC2 does show a bump at the very beginning. This program does 4 kilobyte chunks, I think, at minimum. So the 1 kilobyte cache on the SLC doesn't quite, cut the mustard for showing up on the graph. But the bump is there because you can see it compared to the other. Here we have 3D Bench. And you'll notice the SX is way behind the SXLC2 in the middle and the 486SLC on the right. There's actually only about 1 FPS difference between the two, despite having about half the bus bandwidth. This is what I was talking about earlier, where we spend a lot of time waiting for the processor to complete a task. So if we can optimize the processor with more cache, we can make up for a severe lack in bus. And here we have Doom, the saddest of the SXLC benchmarks. This thing with the cache turned off is really slow. And you can see here, it's got to go out to RAM every time it's got to crunch numbers. So we have half the bandwidth, we have half the frame capability. And this is contrary to, our 3D Bench result, where the bus bandwidth difference didn't really make a huge impact because we had some cache stuff we could work with. But that's not the case here. The SLC on the right and the SX on the left, the only difference between those two is 1K of internal cache. And so, yeah, it makes a huge difference. I wish I could run the SXLC on the with cache turned on for this, but that's not happening right now. Here we are, 3 boards in order: SX40, SXLC2-40, and the SLC-40. These two share on-die cache. These two share 62 megabytes of memory bandwidth. So it's not really a surprise that this is kind of a bridge between them. It's the average of the two, I guess. But it is unfortunate that PC chips did not implement the flush cache function, and so it does cause problems. The pins they left disconnected are perfectly fine on an SX because they're just not used. They are either not internally connected, or one of them is float. We don't care about that because we don't have a socket to put another processor on, so we have no reason to float this processor. And yeah, we just damn it, PC chips. But like I said, they did the fake cache too. This must have been what they started getting away with, and then they kind of escalated to bigger scams maybe in the future. And I think we got enough to know where it sits, though. Let me know in the comments below if you had any of these growing up. I had an SX system, but it was a 25, and I didn't think it could do much of really anything. But if I had one of these, I would probably have been happy with it. Maybe not this one. If I tried to game on this one, I probably would have been pretty sad. But yeah, let me know what you think. And if you have any questions, leave them below. Thank you.